Day 2 of the January 6 hearings were held on Capitol Hill today. The schedule had an abrupt change because former Trump campaign head Bill Stepien did not testify as planned. Why? Good reason. His wife went into labor. So instead, the committee aired his taped deposition. All right, joining us now is CBS News Chief Washington Correspondent Major Garrett. Even though the hearing is in the rearview mirror now by, I think, about an hour, I would love to hear your takeaways for folks who didn't catch it on the broadcast. What stood out to you?
A couple of things, Tony. First, the committee wants to tell a story that is true, but wants to tell it with voices it believes will be closer to those who most in this country need to be persuaded of that underlying truth. Who do I mean? I mean Trump supporters. So the committee knows full well that having a bunch of Democrats say President Trump did a lot of terrible and dangerous things to the future of American democracy probably wouldn't get them very far. But having those who were closest to the former president, who were trusted advisors either in his campaign or in his government, all people put there because the president decided they were trustworthy, professional, and competent to tell this story is the best way to get that story across to that still skeptical segment of the American public, which is to say Trump supporters. And what is that story? That the president lost the election, that it was not stolen, and that the evidence that he kept pointing to of potential ways in which it might have been stolen never manifested themselves. And to make the point that in American courts, if not American politics, anecdotes are not evidence. Conjecture is not conclusion. And if you don't have evidence and all you have is conjecture, theories, and conspiracy theories, you don't have a case. And when you don't have a case, under the history and precedent of this country, you should stop. Former President Trump not only did not stop, he continued to propagate the big lie. And the other thing that struck me about today's hearing is it introduced, for consideration, a second class of victims. Who are these victims? Trump supporters who gave their own money through small donations to a fund purportedly to fight election fraud that never did. And that money was kept and siphoned off in other directions having nothing to do with combating purported election fraud in any jurisdiction before any court or any other case. It didn't do what the Trump campaign said it was meant to do, and I think that opened up for the Justice Department the potential questions: can fraud cases be brought and successfully prosecuted against those who did that?
Major, you said that this was really focused on the people who most needed to be persuaded, including the Attorney General, Bill Barr, who laid out an extensive rebuttal to former President Trump's allegations of election fraud, which have been widely disputed. But you mentioned when you're talking about the Trump supporters, do you think that the Attorney General's testimony today or any of those other testimonies might change their opinions?
Look, it's a good question, and I don't have an absolute answer. And if you're going to ask me, do you think there's much look-in among hardcore Trump supporters to the January 6th hearings? No. But it's part of the atmospheric of the American dialogue and conversation. You can't really miss it because the networks like CBS are devoting so much attention to it. And the evidentiary record is being fully established. And the fact that it is mostly established by those within the Trump inner circle matters, because that's going to percolate. Because even if this process is denounced in right-wing media outlets, they will have to be denouncing people from the Trump orbit, which is a complicated bit of business. Not suggesting it won't be tried, not suggesting in some instances it might not be successful. But it's a much harder case than to say, oh, the woke, rabid, progressive, communist left is doing all this. Well, you can't put Bill Stepien in that category. You can't put Eric Hirschman, who was one of President Trump's lawyers during the first impeachment trial, in that category. Yeah. You certainly can't put Bill Barr in that category or any of the others we heard testify today. So you have to develop a whole new set of grievances against a whole new set of enemies in order to disprove in your own mind what the committee is presenting. And those enemies have to come from the Trump world. That's the difficult bit of business that the committee is laying before the country, and specifically hardcore Trump supporters.
That is tricky, Major. Speaking of things that might be tried and that might be successful, when you look ahead to the scheduled hearings yet to come, what might be tried, what might be successful?
Well, what the committee is going to do, and I think the reason it has so many different hearings, is to say this is a long story. It doesn't get better in the retelling. And even though, broadly speaking, American public, you think you know what the story is, you actually don't. And you don't know how many different ways the former president of the United States explored options to subvert an election that was fairly held, accurately counted, and verifiably substantiated. And all those various mechanisms were tried, thought about, some were put in motion, some were not. But ultimately, when frustrated with all those other things that former President Trump might use the government of the United States to try to accomplish, he turned to his supporters, hoping some sort of popular uprising would be the thing that would turn the tide in his favor. And that is completely new territory for the history of our democracy. A sitting president trying to assemble a popular uprising to storm the Capitol and intimidate members of Congress to stop them from doing what they were supposed to do on January 6th, was the orderly transition of power by certifying electoral votes. And what the committee wants to do is say it's a very long story to get to January 6th. And if you think this is all just about that fateful day, you need to stop and listen to everything that preceded it.
Major, I always appreciate how you put things in the context of this historical moment. Major, great talking to you.
Thank you.